So good evening, everybody. Indeed, a very, very warm welcome to one and all. Thank you all for joining us. It is wonderful to see such a great turnout. So yes, my name is Roak Peffers. I represent the gallery that represents Paul. So we are all here really in celebration of Paul's career retrospective, which opened at the Wits Art Museum. For those of you who haven't been, please do go. It really is a staggeringly beautiful show. It's essentially 4.5 decades of Paul's creative output, and there are some absolutely beautiful images, and I do encourage you all to go and have a look. Paul's doing a walkabout there on Saturday, if you would like, at midday, and the show is up until the end of July, so please do try and find the time to go. We are here today to talk about the book that we have done called Between the Cracks, which was published by Blackman Rousseau. Matthew and Chad are somewhere in the back, carring away, I suppose. Serving wine, yes. Great career in publishing. But anyway, it is my pleasure and indeed daunting task to introduce these two gentlemen. So on my far right is Anton Harber, who I think needs very little introduction, but for anyone who doesn't know, Anton was the founder editor of the anti-apartheid newspaper, which was then called the Weekly Mail, which subsequently became the Mail and Guardian. He is the chair of the Conference of Editors in 1991, the National Association of Broadcasters in 1998, and the Freedom of Expression Institute in 2010. He is now the Caxton Professor of Journalism at the University of Witwatersrand, the chair of the Freedom of Expression Institute. He is the convener of judges for South Africa's biggest journalism prize, which is the Taku Caper Investigative Journalism Award and Awards and Grants. And Anton writes a weekly column in Business Day. Paul also had the gall to potentially offend Anton the last time he spoke, so we hope Anton's going to be kind to Paul today. And then we have Paul Weinberg. Paul Weinberg is indeed one of the great storytellers of our generation. He is a photographer, a filmmaker, a writer, a curator, and an educationist and an archivist, but we like to refer to him as an artist. Paul began his career in the 1970s working in South African NGOs and photographing current events for news agencies and foreign countries. He was a founder member of Afropix and South, the collective photo agencies that gained local and international recognition for their uncompromising role in documenting apartheid and popular resistance to it. From 1990 onwards, Paul worked increasingly concentrated on feature rather than news photography, and indeed rejects the moniker struggle photographer. His images have been widely exhibited and published both locally and abroad, and he has initiated several major photographic projects, notably Then and Now, which was a collection of photographers from the collective photographic movement of the 1980s, Umhlaba, which was a project on land, and The Other Camera, which was a project about vernacular photography in South Africa. In 1993, Paul won the Mother Jones International Documentary Award for his portrayal of the fisher folk of Cozy Bay on South Africa's north coast. And Paul has taught photography at the Center of Documentary Studies at Duke University and Masters in Documentary Arts at the University of Cape Town. Paul is indeed one of the great storytellers of this generation, and like I say, I do encourage you all to go and see his wonderful show that is on at WHAM. And without any further ado from me, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Paul and Anton.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. It really is. Paul and I go back a long, long way. Back to Yeovil in the late 70s, early 80s. But worked together a lot in the Weekly Mail in the late 80s, when Paul was with Afropix and others. And so we have worked together, fought together, and so it's a great pleasure. And you know, I'd always known through these years of the varied work he was doing and the extraordinary dedication he had to his craft over these many years. But it was only really when seeing this magnificent book and the equally rich exhibition at WHAM, the Wits Art Museum, that I came to appreciate the full scope of this remarkable body of work. and the impact it has had. So a special thanks to those who produced such a handsome book. And such an interesting exhibition. I think Fiona's here tonight, so Fiona Rankin-Smith, well done. She's hiding somewhere there, but I advise you to see the exhibition at WAM. And as you know, when you leave tonight, it's compulsory to buy at least one copy of the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a conversation with Paul. And then I'll open it up for questions or comments or discussion. And Paul, I want to talk about the different types of work you've done at different times, or ask you about, and to highlight the range and the variety of the work you have done over these years. But let's start with where we came from, which I think we could call the activist work of the 1980s. You write, we were unashamedly partisan and saw the camera as a weapon against the system. You quote yourself in the book. The camera as a weapon against the system. And I want to ask you this, thinking back on that, after all these years and the experience you've had since then. That partisanship, did it enrich your work, or did it in any way diminish it?
Well, thanks for that incredibly tough question, Anton. Nothing like an icebreaker for you. But I'm going to just respond with an icebreaker, because I did work for the Weekly Mail, then. That's where, and I was there from the start. And, we used to do various projects and cover various things, mostly uncommissioned. And then take a chance and see if Anton and Owen would be interested in publishing them. And the one time I was photographing, and you'll see it in the book. It was December 16, and it was either known as Dingon's Day. Do you remember? And there are lots of you here, sorry, that I just need to reference, who come from that time, and it's lovely to see you all. And so I went to the Dingon's Day celebration. Then there was always the other side, which was Liberation Day, Freedom Day, and those was very interesting juxtapositions. Anyway, I was there and I was taking photographs, and there weren't too many people there. And there was a guy called Koos van der Merwe. Do you remember Koos van der Merwe? He was in the Conservative Party, and then he joined the IFP. And he came up to me, big guy, big boop. He said, "Yeah, who are you working for?" And I said, "The Weekly Mail." He said, "Yeah, very weekly." Anyway, so coming back to the question that Anton wants me to answer. Well, it wasn't really hard to be partisan in those days, because it was a time of black and white, them or us. It was very clear. And those of you who I'm looking at, many of you from that time remember that so well. And the family of Afropix was very clear that we wanted to tell the story that wasn't being told by the South African government, and often by the mainstream media, who didn't really take too many risks, or if when they did, they were banned. And so there was this liminal space for the alternate press and activism, journalism and photography. And Anton and Owen were pioneers in that. And this was before the Vrye Weekblad. And so the question is, did it hinder or did it bolster us? I think that's what you asked me, something like that. It wasn't a question. We're in it, okay? And when I say we're in it, it wasn't just the hard news. It was the sort of the church gathering in Mamelodi, to defy removals or whatever it was, we were always there. Or, the early formations of the trade union movement, you'd often be the only photographer there. The mainstream press wasn't interested. And then, we played it back into the Weekly Mail, we played it back into the World, we played it back into the archive of Afropix. And the archive of Afropix was used widely. Your hands up. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Maybe turn up the hearing aid. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm back to Afropix. And when Afropix was being formed, I had I knew David Goblet. I'd met him a few years before, and I saw him. He asked me for a picture, and I dropped it off, and he said, and I said, yeah, we're establishing Afropix. And he looked at me and he said, that's a disaster. You're going to get raided by the police. Anyway, 4 years later, he was absolutely right. We were raided by the police, and we were in Khotsa House. Not only did they raid Afropix, it was before the Delmas trial, but a year later they blew up Khotsa House. So we knew we were taking that risk. We were unashamedly partisan. We actually called ourselves the Taking Sides generation. And that comes from a film. I don't know if you saw it. I think it's El Salvador? Is that a cue to say I'm talking too much? Okay. Anyway, in the film, Jeff Bridges is the photojournalist, and he comes in as one of those objective photojournalists, and he's wearing a flap jacket, and he's very soon caught up in some kind of fracas, and the police come and round them up, and he's in jail, and with a whole lot of partisans or comrades, and they say to him, "What side do you take?" And he said, "I don't take sides, I take pictures." And of course that that turns around, because he ultimately gets sensitized and listens to the voice of the people, and he does take sides. Anyway, we were the taking sides generation. That was the short answer.
No, thank you for that, Paul. But I think it's important to remember how risky taking photos then could be, but also how important it was to produce those images which captured what was going on in this country. And certainly there are images in the book which jumped out at me as great iconic images of that period. Many of them took a great deal of courage. And if I remember correctly, in the raid on Afropix you're talking about, you lost a lot of pictures which you never recovered. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did lose. There was Afropix and Afroscope, and the security police at the time were looking for material to indict the UDF leadership. And Afroscope, and Harriet was one of the founders as well, we had videos and anti-apartheid films that never came back. The other thing about the raid was they slapped a summons of high treason on us. So we were all going to be either state witnesses or also be indicted. Fortunately, I was working for Der Spiegel at the time, and I got an extended assignment in Zimbabwe, and I covered the non-aligned movement, and I was kind of out of sight for about 2 or 3 months. Yeah. So these were the times. I mean, and as if you do go to the exhibition, there's a little installation, and there's a great song by James Phillips and the Cherry-Faced Lurchers, which summed up the times, and it goes something like this: "These O's are heavy, these O's are tough, these O's are serious, these O's will fuck you up." And that's what it was, and they really did. And I'm looking around and I see Louise Gubb, who experienced a lot of that, and TJ and Mark. Mark was more. He comes later. He was an art photographer. He was much smarter. Those were heavy, and it was heavy times. But it didn't deter us, because as Joyce Osinski wrote about documentary photography and photojournalism, the related cousin, she said every photograph was a victory against amnesia and the system. And Anton, through the Mail and Garden, Weekly Mail, Vrye Weekblad, and the alternative press, gave space and gave a voice, which we were just a conduit, really, for the communities who were really taking the brunt of it.
You were the conduit for the communities. We were the conduit for the photographers. The other night, I mean, the situation described creates its own set of ethical dilemmas and debates and fights and arguments. And you reminded me of an argument we had about 35 years ago about the Weekly Mail's use of a picture of a mob killing of a spy, an agent that where you were actually present, I think. And you talked about yourself deliberately delaying to avoid getting a picture that would show who was doing it, and getting upset with us for running a picture that showed the faces of those committing the murder. And you said that that I stood firm, said we had to run the picture. So I think it's time we settled this argument. Looking back 35 years, do you feel the same? Do you feel differently?
So let me defer to Dennis Davis and say, you be the judge, and let me present the facts and the story then. So yes, we were partisan, we took sides, and you had this recurring thing during those times. You'd have a funeral, you would have someone would be buried, there was a huge police and military presence, there'd be anger, there'd be another outbreak of protest, someone would be shot, sometimes more than one person, and then there'd be another funeral, and so it would go on week after week, week after week, and became really, really tiring, extremely difficult to sort of absorb all of this, and also try and, get iconic, interesting images, because, images are always in conversation with each other. The next week this needs to be another image, not the same. So it wasn't easy, both emotionally and also in terms of what we were witnessing. But at that time, I was sort of kind of very reluctant to take those photographs. I'm not trying to sanctify myself. I'm just telling you, I was. And others did. Others were there and they ran. I ran very slowly. Okay, I was a lot thinner and faster then, but I ran slowly, and I deliberately didn't get there on time. I'm not sure if Louise was there because I don't think she was. She was at many others. Were you there, Louise? Leandra. You weren't there. Where were you? Were you taking a day off? Okay, but Louise was everywhere, but she wasn't there that day. But Peter Magabani was there, and in that incident, the comrades ran after this person who they identified as a vigilante. He was hacked to death at his house, and then they moved to the house, and they were going to kill the family. And Peter Magabane was there, and somehow I was next to him. And Peter said in Zulu, because that's a Zulu-speaking area, Yima, Yima, and people stopped. And he asserted his authority as a Zulu-speaking man, and they stopped. And it didn't happen. And Peter actually won an award for that. It was the Robert Carper Bravery Award for journalism and photography. And I was right there, and there was a BBC crew. So after that, the pictures get recirculated, obviously. There's pressure on all the photographers. That's what they're paid for. AP, AFP, Reuters, Newsweek, and Mail and Guardian. But Mail and Guardian, the Weekly Mail, got that from Judah Ngwenya, who was photographing for Reuters, sorry. Judah from Reuters. And Anton ran it. And well, there was a discussion because, I said, Anton, you can't. He said, why? And I said, because you're going to expose these men who are going to then probably hang. This is a civil war. And Anton, I think you said, but it happened in the public domain, which was quite right. Anton was right. I was taking sides, and we were at a sort of juncture, So you be the judge, The Weekly Mail ran the story. I haven't followed it up. I don't know if those young comrades were arrested and then tried, but it did happen, and some were arrested, tried, and hanged. It was that time. What do you think?
So that's quite interesting because I'm not so sure I was right.
Uh-huh.
But of course, it was clearly Irwin's decision, and he's sitting over there, so we can make him account for it. But to complete the story, we really need to find out what happened,
We do.
don't we?
Yeah.
What happened to the people in that picture, so we must try.
So there's another side to that. And, we tripped and fell and found ourselves in these awkward places. But there were photographers like Johan Koos, who worked for SIPA. He was a very good photographer, but he was to the right of, Attila the Hun. He was...
Koos van der Merwe.
And Koos. and Eugene. And he carried a gun on assignment. And he was very proud to do that. And he was also proud that he'd killed people on assignment who threatened him. But he would, and Louise knows this because there was a kind of article that came out about it. He would quite often also volunteer his material to the security police. And the story, and what would have happened. People would be identified, they'd be picked up. So he was our nemesis, and we really couldn't, we had to take a stand. I was in the South African Union of Journalists. Louise was in the international version of that. And, the ethos and the ethics of journalism is you don't carry a gun on assignment. Your pen and your camera are your weapons. So he was very difficult to be around with. And an article appeared in the Dennis Beckett, wonderful kind of provocative person that he is, ran a story in the Sunday Star about him being the extremist. And he wrote, and he said how proud he was to have survived all these things and challenged people when they threatened him. And then I wrote a response, which was from the union point of view, this really isn't on, and it became a kind of a debate. Anyway, for the next many years, Johan Koos, whenever he saw me, I think he reached for his gun. I kind of hid behind others like Peter Magabane, and I said, okay, take a chance. Anyway, so there was very, very a clear division between us and them, and what was going on.
So, Paul, you mentioned Afropix and Afroscope. So you sometimes worked in a collective like that, and there was at a later stage South, right?
Yeah.
Another collective. Sometimes you were a lone ranger.
Yeah.
Sometimes you worked for institutions like Race Relations or the Electoral Commission. So why don't you talk a little about the differences? What drew you to the collective? What was your preference?
Yeah, so, I was in Afropix, and we were like a collective with a capital C, okay? And we did a film about 10 or 15 years ago called Then and Now, where we reflected on, photographers then and photographers now. And Guy Tillam, when we interviewed him, he spoke about the fact that we were so uncompetitive. And that's how we were. I mean, we would often be, a number of Afropix photographers taking photographs of the same assignment, and then we'd put the pictures down, and then we'd make a decision. Oh, it's got to be that one. And off it went. And it didn't matter who was the photographer. It was quite amazing. And if anyone kind of broke those rules, like jumped the gun, hi, Anton. Before the Afropix photographers come, I'm also an Afropix. I like this one. It was just not on. So we worked like that, and we genuinely did work like that for many years. And just like a side, because you probably know much more about the Bang Bang Club than you know about Afropix. Greg Marinovich is not here, thank God. Okay. But they had a very different ethos, and that ethos was about getting the World Press Award and getting the picture. And there was a lot of pressure on all of us to get the picture, believe it or not, really, whether you were like Afropix or Time or Newsweek or Bang Bang Club. But we didn't have that we didn't work like that. But at the same time, I every now and then would get lucky, and I'd get an assignment. The big magazine that I worked for many years was Der Spiegel, and I worked for Der Spiegel for 13 years, way up into 1998. And then I think I got my first job, proper job, when I was employed by the Independent Electoral Commission. And for 4 months, I photographed the election process, which was a remarkable opportunity for me. So, yeah, but maybe just to reference what you're saying, Anton, I was a reluctant war photographer. I didn't enjoy it. I really, and I don't know if I was that good at it. But my sort of default position was always documentary, beyond the news, features. And when 1994 happened, I thought, oh, thank God. I don't have to do this anymore. And I kind of trajected into, much more feature work, in-depth work. And this is where a number of my projects have kind of went to. Spirituality, in-depth work, turning the camera on myself with Dear Edward and so on, which I see you bought a copy. Thank you very much. It's out of print, and it's a collector's item. No pressure. Okay.
So you raise your pictures of, in relation to spirituality. And so that's quite a leap from the sort of pictures we've been talking about. And one gets that part in the book where you're taking pictures of people in pursuit of spirituality, first of all. And that's quite a contrast. So what drew you to that?
It was really a response to the trap, I think, that we fell into. And Ruak has sort of alluded to already. As people sort of reflect on photographers like me and our generation, they love to call us struggle photographers. And then we didn't do anything else. I mean, we didn't think about anything else. So I've been really working hard to, get sort of get rid of that moniker for many years. And I was always interested in other things beyond, the news. We were drawn there. So after 1994, I pursued those kind of projects. And I was very interested in looking at how ordinary people responded to reality. And because of apartheid, colonialism, globalization, the majority of people practice some kind of faith. And that was one trajectory that drew me there. And the other one was I was sort of going through a bit of a rough time, and I was depressed with a capital D. And my family sent me to a psychiatrist who said, "My boy, this is your third episode. You're over 40. Depression, I must tell you, is a chemical thing. Take these little red pills, and good luck." And after 3 months, I wrote back to him. I said, "The only thing that's happened is I'm constipated and I get dizzy." So I realized that maybe the camera and my intimacy, with spirituality is going to be a healer. And that's what I did. So my journey with spirituality had another trajectory.
And it cured your constipation.
Absolutely.
What a relief.
And my dizziness.
But then towards the end of the book, you look at places of spirituality and that body of work. So what's interesting is you had various projects at different times. All of them are substantial long-term projects. That one is different in not just because many of the pictures are in color, but because they're mostly places, landscapes, mostly without people. And it's the people that one and your empathy and the intimacy of your interaction with them that's striking throughout the book. Then you have these works which are about place and a very particular kind of place. So that was a very different bit of work for you, was it not?
Yeah, very much. But it also is now 15 years after Moving Spirit. And what also became very real for me is that in the understanding of land, it's also highly political and politicized. And as you know, all of you as South Africans, I don't need to tell you. And I was particularly interested in how people mark the land and signify the land. And that drew me to the land and seeing the land through another lens, not just political, not just, white and black, but from a variety of different trajectories. And that took me on a journey, north, south, east, west, in my 40-year-old Land Rover. And immensely, immensely interesting. It's not a bestseller, I have to tell you, but it was very enriching. I say that when I used to lecture, people used to say, "Well, how do I make a living from photography?" And I used to say, "Geez, do I know? Can I give you an answer?" And I'd say, "Look, be prepared. That you might not make a living, but at least you will be enriched by the experience." So it was a very enriching experience, Anton.
And no constipation.
No constipation, no dizziness.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one last question, then throw it open. So I said how many of these were long-term projects that you worked on over long periods of time. And in fact, the other night you spoke of a picture of a fisherman in Cozy Bay that I think you said it took you 3 years to get him in the right place at the right time and the right light, get the picture, which is completely extraordinary. And we live in a time when everyone is snapping away with their phones. relentlessly, endlessly, in complete contrast to the craft. So one has to ask, where does this leave your craft?
I'm just breathing in, ruminating on the question. Well, let me sort of answer it kind of from a different trajectory. So in the early 2000s, I had survived by being a photojournalist. That was my main source of income, working for magazines, sometimes for corporates, doing SCI projects, NGOs. And by the sort of early 2000s, the bottom had fallen out of photojournalism. And, it was a real struggle to make a living. So I decided to, kind of review, reassess, and I was fortunate to get a bursary at Duke University, and I did a master's degree, and I worked in the archives. I'd already been interested in the archives. Afripix was an archive, and now I could formally work in an archive. So with my master's degree, I then went and worked in an archive, and I worked at UCT for 10 years before the fire. And so that's where I went. And then I did just projects that interested me along the way. And one of them is Dear Edward. And it's a project where I turned the camera on myself and I followed my own roots. And my family comes from Latvia. They were expelled from Russia, and then they met someone in Brussels who told them, and they said, come to South Africa where the pigeons are roasted and knives and forks, and they fly with knives and forks. It's a land of milk and honey. So that part of my great-grandfather landed up in the huge metropolis called Philippolis as a SMOS, and then the next big project was, they got into the hotel business, and then the family moved around the interior from hotel to hotel, and that was part of the project, is to trace my roots. So that's another project. I've got a few, up my sleeve. Just they come every now and again. I don't have to do them every day, like you, Anton. Mm-hmm. You don't have to work every day, right? We're retired. We're in the transit lounge.
I think you said you have been involved in 21 books over your career. That's a remarkable amount. Which one was the bestseller?
I have to think about that, but the answer comes to me very quickly. None.
Which one's about to become the best?
This one. No, this is a collector's item. It has a print run of 500. So, no pressure.
Pressure.
And they signed. Well, there was one book actually that did quite well, and it's just by chance. I did a project around the millennium it was the intersection of indigenous people, wildlife, conservation, and this was a big kind of moment because colonialism and apartheid were the same in many ways. They considered conservation areas or wildlife areas or game reserves as their domain, and they did the same thing. They removed the indigenous people, built fences, and there was no beneficiation for communities. And then they realized, man, there's like a poaching issue. I wonder why. And then, some clever person from WWF said, I think it's got to do with the fact that local communities don't get a benefit. Anyway, the whole conversation changed. I was... and I wanted to explore that. So I went to 7 different countries with 9 different writers. Not easy. But it was an extraordinary experience. And that book was called Once We Were Hunters. And then it was published in South Africa and was published in Holland. And Holland has a version of Oxfam. Can't remember what it's called. Anyway, Oxfam bought this book as a sort of a Christmas present for all its members. And there I kind of got a bit of pocket money for once.
Very good.
Not a bestseller, though.
Very, very good. And let me just say that this book includes some very fine essays as well about your work and the context of the work. One by yourself, one by Tamar Garb, and one by Jacob Dlamini, and that's a great lineup. So I think that's a great part of the book. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes, you, and then I'll come to you. Sorry, over there first. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. This is a question on a rather sort of personal note, but given that you've spoken about your constipation and dizziness, I sort of feel like it's given me a bit of license. When you reflect back on your body of work, the stuff that you took during the very oppressive times under apartheid, state of emergency and so on, can I ask you how that has sort of affected your psyche and how you sort of look upon that time, whether it's with a sense of sort of total trepidation and a period of darkness for you, or whether you've managed to kind of store it in a place inside yourself that you're at peace with?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's really, really important. So I'll answer it in a different way. So, you know, us photojournalists, photographers, filmmakers, journalists, we kind of have this sort of rather like brazen armory. You know, we go and cover these things, we witness deaths and painful things, and then we, you know, go to the pub and, you know, have a couple of shots and then like wake up the next morning and we're ready for it. Right, Louise? Right. She's nodding her head. Yes and no, you know. It's very hard to simply forget a lot of the things that you see. So without sort of sanctifying myself, the Taking Sides generation, I think we like to see ourselves as participatory observers, that we were involved in all these things, but we also wanted to kind of make a statement or be aligned. So that made the photography a lot easier. But more recently, I've been involved with a group of people in Cape Town who are doing this project about Table Mountain, Hurikwaga, and they wanted to have a ceremony, and I've been in conversation with them to give the Table Mountain a legal status, and this has been happening around the world. That, you know, and it's well known amongst First People. They talk about that the land doesn't belong to us, that we belong to the land, and so they felt the need, and it was a whole group of Sangomas, environmental activists, and so on. We walked. So to do the ceremony wasn't simple. We had to walk up Table Mountain, and I'm not as sort of thin and, you know, frisky as I was. Anyway, I was walking up Table Mountain, and I was kind of like, to be honest, struggling. and I was struggling, and there were a whole lot of people helping me, like the White Lions, and, you know, from Timbavati pushing me along. And I got to a point, and I just didn't know, man. Suddenly something came to me, and I just sort of reflected, and I thought, you know, I'm carrying a lot of burden on me. I'm carrying a lot, not just my camera bag, but I was carrying a lot of these stories that, you know, are lost, and have been out there in the landscape. And I suddenly realized I need to release these stories. I mean, I've tried to get them, published, and whether I was successful or not is not so important. But I've carried these stories, and these stories are painful, and they continue to be painful in this country. We've got a country of very, very difficult and painful stories. Anyway, I was like 3/4 of the way up the mountain, and I was, had a reflection, and I just thought, no, I need to release these stories because they are very burdensome. And thanks for being with me, but I need to let you go. So I had this sort of moment, and I kind of let go of some of these stories that have been with me. And I'm now talking about the sand, for example, 30-year journey with the sand. And I've witnessed, this is not the front line and people dying. This is people whose lives have been turned upside down. Beautiful people who lived in harmony for thousands of millennia, hundreds of millennia. And then suddenly, they've had to, in a very short space of time, they lost their land, they were militarized, painful. And not many people were interested in those stories. The stories they wanted about the sand were, gods must be crazy. They want to, journalist after journalist, photographer after photographer, wanted to sort of reinvent the sand, set them up, pretend you're on a hunt, and not really tell the real story, or stories that were, let's say, reflected. And so 3/4 of the way up the mountain, I let go some of these stories that were adding to my difficulty in walking up the mountain. I did. Miracles happen, Marcus.
If you climb up that route, you might bump into a story or two.
I just wanted to know if your view, obviously, of mankind has been a bit tainted by all your experience. Do you still have positive things about it? You still, when you get up in the morning, think, no, the world is beautiful. There's still something, about it.
Do you want to answer that question?
I'll answer for him.
Can I pass it on?
No, you can't.
Can I call a friend?
It's a tough question, isn't it?
It's a tough one, yeah. Do you want to help me out there?
Well, I haven't seen you taking pictures of roses and
landscapes. I've done landscapes.
Yes, but landscapes, are landscapes. They often tell you more about people than when there are people in the landscapes.
No, I'll answer it this way. I really am very privileged to have, seen so many different scenarios in my life, and been in places. And often I pushed myself. I'd rejected the opportunity to become a corporate lawyer, and I became a photographer. And one of the things about this country, particularly, I can't really talk about anywhere else because I live here, is the people in this country are extraordinary. And they're just so heartwarming, the stories that they share with you. And so, this just gives me such, encouragement. It buoys me. It gives me just so much hope. And while we're a country that has great difficulties and challenges, I really know in my heart that the people of this country, all people of this country, when you get that formula right, like the Springbok rugby team, we are winners. We are such winners. And I mean, I've been in situations, and I'm still working in that field. For example, I live in Muizenberg, and nowhere in South Africa where you say, well, that's like an enclave. That's, I just closed my door. There's a gated community, and I never really have to see this anymore. No, Muizenberg is part of the bigger Muizenberg abuts Vrygrond, the oldest informal settlement in Cape Town. So you can't really think of, I'm in Muizenberg, I close the door, I don't have to see anything. Because a lot of those people come through, they're waste pickers. And I did a film about waste picking. And also during COVID, I was part of the CAN project. The most incredible people, who live on the other side of the M5, as people would like to see. No, this is our community. And, when you start to see one community and how we can actually be of benefit to each other, it's just a completely different vista. And the most amazing people. I mean, the one guy who's a waste picker and supported by an incredible guy called Mike Kumalo, who runs a waste picking little service. And he'd been in Pollsmoor prison. And he says, for him, waste picking is gold. Other people's trash is his gold. He gets up every day, and that's what he does. I mean, wow, that kind of, my dizziness and constipation just disappear into the distance by comparison.
So I think we have to say it's a great relief that you gave up on law. It's a great relief to us all that you gave up on law, particularly to the legal fraternity, because you would have been a crap lawyer. Yes. There's a mic.
Thank you. Paul, I just wanted, in terms of all your struggle photography and stuff, did you ever feel those Afrikaners, did you ever feel terrified of them? Because I grew up in the West Rand in Roodepoort in a Greek shop, so I was very conscious of them. And I just wondered if you had direct contact with, were you ever really shitting yourself in pride?
So can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I mean, what's striking is there are a number of pictures here of the right wing, loosely. But I looked at them and thought, well, I think the skill is that you managed to humanize them. I'm not sure you empathized with them, but somehow you got beyond the facade, the simple image we all have and had of the right wing. Would you think?
Well, Afrikaners, let's say in the broader sense, people of the land, with many, many attributes, and, as a photographer, journalist, you enter these spaces. So I remember when, the 1994 elections, and I was working for Der Spiegel, and she wanted to get a story on the right wing, and she would phone up, and she'd, the Conservative Party, and then she'd say, "Hello, this is Almut here. Just wondering if I want to interview a right-wing farmer." And it wasn't working, and then she tried the Avia beer. "Hello, it's Almut." I said, "Almut, I don't think that approach is going to work. Just come with me." And so Louise is laughing because she knows how this is. I mean, journalists, they really put us in these caricature situations. So I said, "Come with me." And so we went to Ventersdorp, right? Now you know the landscape, what Ventersdorp means, and sort of the political landscape. And we went and we booked into the Ventersdorp Hotel. And then I said, "Come with me, Almut. Let's go to the pub." We went to the pub, and there were all these guys in Kortbroek, and packing pieces and shaking hands like this, and doing this, which means I'm another Avia beer supporter. Interestingly enough, that's also the handshake of Swapo. Anyway, so I'm sitting there, I'm seeing all this, and Almut is there. And I go to the bar and I say, "Wat drink julle?" "Ja, brandy and coke. Yeah. Go back, go big. So this outsider, Buddha Yurt, sitting there having a drink. And then they said, what are you doing here? I said, no, I'm here with my friend from Germany. I'm showing her the country. I didn't say Der Spiegel, the anti-apartheid magazine, who's looking for a right-wing farmer. I said, she's here to understand what's going on. And what is going on? And, no, I'm a farmer, and I live here. And I say, Elmo, come here. Sit down and have a beer as well, or a wine. And honestly, within 2 minutes, this person says, yeah, my name's Pete. We've got a farm here. I live around here. And you're welcome to come and visit. And I'm just, we tend to look at South Africa often in very kind of binary ways, And when you get through to people, it's extraordinary what happens. So, part of the story continues. So I was telling Anton, sorry, Anton, you'll have to have another glass of wine just to, sit through this again. So we're doing the story. And the story was, the caricature Afrikaner, gun-toting, before the elections. And we're driving around, and then he's taking us, and then he says, here are my workers. Okay. And, one time, one of my workers' wives was very heavily pregnant. And so I put her in my bakkie, and we went to the nearest hospital, which was Koster. And we got there, and I told the matron, please deliver this woman's baby. And she said, no. Jesus, this is only for whites. And he said, you know what I did? I took out my gun and I said, if you don't fucking deliver this baby, I am going to do some damage to you. And she was delivered in Costa. And of course, Almut never wrote that story because it didn't fit in with the narrative, of these sort of pejorification of Afrikaners. So I'm trying to answer your question, Irene, and I spend a lot of time with Afrikaners, and as a Yurt, there's this sort of this dualistic thing that happens, and when they'd say, oh, Weinberg, is jy Yurt? Ja, ek is oom. And then they say, oh yeah, people of the book, and then once I was also in Louis Trichardt working for Der Spiegel, and I spent time photographing them, and afterwards, I was about to go, and I said, dankie Alma, and this woman put her hand through my hands. She said to her husband, kyk hoe krul hierdie jokie se hare. So, there are all these kind of beautiful things that happen in a way. And I think, you just have to sort of suspend some of these things, and your prejudice and listen. And there's a kind of magic sometimes that happens. Anyway, these are some of my experiences.
And it's extraordinary how every picture has a story behind it. But I think the moral of the story about the farmer and the pregnant worker is sometimes it's useful to pack a gun.
I don't know if you want to go now. I've got another story that I can
Go ahead, yes.
Honestly, you can leave. Or you buy a book and then leave.
Yeah.
I was terrified of those. Yeah, there's one photograph. I was shot at. It happened a lot. The death squad. And I'm sure they were Afrikaners. I don't think they came from Michael House and they were doing this. Their sort of housemanship or entree into like the world. Those were terrifying things. But strangely enough, even, Paul Erasmus, the one who hunted us all down as white lefties, when you sort of pass that place with him at some point, And then he sort of revealed to himself that he really kind of admired us, especially Roger Lucy, who he, tracked and destroyed Roger's career all those years. And then, when finally, Roger and him got together and he said, yeah, Roger, I really liked your music, but I was doing a job, we had to fuck you up. And, it's sort of, so this is the weird South African scenario. But I think what I, just can throw in here about stories is, and Anton spoke about me being a storyteller. I am a storyteller. And I think I was a storyteller before I knew I was a storyteller, because I always saw things beyond the news and beyond that wire photograph. And I would take notes and write things down. And I even wrote some poems. Oh, my God. Help. And some of those are in a book called Traveling Light, which isn't here, so I don't have to embarrass myself. But the thing about stories and difficult scenarios in South Africa, just to take note of, what stories do is they break down barriers between race, class, and geography. And they also animate us to be human. And that's my mantra, is, that's why I love stories, because through stories we can find each other and, connect with each other. Can I say amen?
I think it's a very good place to end.